Hello, welcome to our webinar, 5 Questions to Guide You to Agile Excellence. My name is Kelly, Marketing Director at Corp, and I will be reviewing some of our housekeeping items before we get started. First, all attendees will be on mute throughout the presentation. If you have any questions about the content, please type them into the Q&A box and we will go through them at the end of the webinar. We are recording the webinar and we'll be sending a follow-up email later today with the recording to all registrants. Okay, thanks for attending today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Corp has been around for over 2 decades, offering a variety of consulting services across data, digital, and business transformation. Our team of skilled consultants offers insights and solutions to the most important problems facing business and government. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Bythewood. Ben is the Agile Practice Lead here at Corp. He has over 10 years of experience as a project manager and Scrum Master, running a wide variety of IT projects in both commercial and public sector. Ben, the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, my name is Bythewood. As Kelly said, really happy to be here and talk about Agile. It's nice to have a captive audience. Usually I'm just cornering my wife and telling her lots of things she doesn't want to know about Agile, so it's nice to have people who might actually want to hear about this and learn about it. So I'm excited to have the opportunity, and thanks everybody for coming. Before we get kind of started into the webinar, wanted to start off kind of a quick poll and get a sense of where people are.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. You should be seeing that on your screen right now. So what is your Agile experience level? Are you just starting to learn, currently attempting Agile, or are you Scrum Master level?
We'll give about 1 minute for folks to answer, and then I'll kind of jump into the presentation.
All right, it looks like we have had most people vote now, so I'm going to go ahead and end it. And Ben, just so you know, it's about, we're leaning more towards just starting to learn.
Okay, great. Well, that's good. You're in the right place. And I think you'll be able to you guys will be able to pick some stuff out of here. But hopefully I have stuff for people at all levels in here. So the topic here is 5 questions to guide you in your Agile adoption. So the overall flow is kind of question-based, but I think we're going to hit a lot of the content of Agile throughout answering those 5 questions, and I hope it gives you some things to think about if you're kind of getting started with Agile or your organization's adopting Agile. But kind of want to start at the beginning with the roots of this whole Agile movement, right? And really, this is all kind of tied to something big that's happening in our economy right now. And I don't know if this gets talked about quite as much in reference to Agile, but it's really the driver behind what's going on with Agile. So an interesting way to look at this is, I think, by looking at the S&P 500, right? The S&P 500 represents the kind of the Goliaths of the American economy, right? These are the biggest businesses, the heaviest hitters in our economy that in many ways represent kind of the fabric of the American economy and what it's all about. So if you look back in 1964, what the data says, the S&P 500 list turned over about every 33 years. So organizations that were on the S&P 500 have an average tenure of 33 years. But by 2016, that's narrowed down to 24. And then by 2027, analysts are predicting that that's going to be about 12 years. So what does that mean? So that means that in the next 10 years, about 250 companies, 250 of the biggest companies in America will be falling off the S&P 500, which basically means that they're contracting and dying. And that's huge. If you look at, I think an example of this is the fact that 21 U.S. retailers have filed for bankruptcy in 2017, and that Amazon is growing at unparalleled rates, 40% of U.S. online retail sales it now represents. So something big's happening in our economy, and I think what we're seeing is a seismic shift in our economy that's somewhere similar to the Industrial Revolution, right? Industrial Revolution was all about interchangeable parts and factories and the assembly line and the workforce moving from the farm to the city, right? New way of doing business and labor, and a total economic shift, right? Well, I think something's happening that same thing's happening in our economy today, around kind of software technology, service-based economy versus a manufacturing and product-based economy, and kind of a shift to the knowledge worker, right? So let's look at, well, what are the causes of this shift? So I think there's kind of three major topics. One is that software and technology are creating new competitive angles. So a good example of this is Uber, right? You look at the taxi cab industry, and it's been ubiquitous in the U.S. and all around the globe for that matter. It's everywhere, and it's been there for as long as we can remember, right? But then a company called Uber comes along, and without buying fleets of taxi cabs, without scaling, across cities to a national level, they're able to create a software application that is, in essence, driving the taxi cab companies out of business. Because with only a piece of software, they were able to create a new competitive angle for taxi cab companies that they weren't able to respond to, and that they honestly didn't know or weren't equipped to compete against. And as you saw with the example of Amazon, that's happening across all economic sectors of our economy right now. And the fact that software companies are able to create these new competitive angles and be so disruptive is creating kind of a new operational model for businesses, right? Where businesses used to have to focus on kind of command and control, positive control of the business and cost control and scaling and creating products in mass quantity, right? Now, businesses are having to shift to kind of what I call a knowledge-based service economy, right? If you look at Uber, for instance, they didn't have to buy fleets of taxi cabs. They didn't have to go hire masses of kind of unskilled workers. What they were composed of were a new kind of worker, which is the knowledge worker, a highly skilled worker who's able to create these effective technical products that allow these companies to compete. So it demands kind of a new operational model that's different from the model that's driven our economy for pretty much 100 years. And then there's also something that a guy named Steve Denning talks about. I'm reading his book right now, The Leader's Guide to Radical Management. He talks about a shift in the economy to delighting customers, right? We used to be an economy where several large kind of conglomerate corporations, had command of the production chain and supply chain and produced a more limited supply of products for people to consume, right? So consumers had less choice, a lot of products, but less choice in those products. Well, now everybody has a website. Anybody who makes anything can quickly get their product to market and use a website and digital marketing to get their product out there. So what's happened is consumers have a vast amount of choice now that they didn't have before. And that choice is driving consumers to be more picky and want what they want, right? So the shift in corporations has now gone from creating a high quality product to creating a delightful customer experience, right? They want to delight their customers so they can keep their customers because the competition for those customers has become pretty fierce. So the problem is customers are finicky, and their opinions and their tastes and their attitudes change rather rapidly. So the keys to success in a corporation have now shifted to being able to measure what customers want at a pretty rapid pace and respond to that at a pretty rapid pace. And that old operational model that we talked about isn't adequate to create that kind of responsiveness. So where do we go from there, right? So what happened was in 2001, some software developers, some like-minded software developers got together who were frustrated with kind of this old operational model, and especially as it applies to software development, and had all kind of been hitting on a new way of doing things. They were all kind of finding a similar model and talking to each other about what they were doing, and they got together in 2001 and published something called the Agile Manifesto, which kind of outlined 4 values and 12 principles that were rooted in doing things completely differently. And this is a real sea change in the way that businesses can do their operations, especially in the way software is developed, but it's really scaled out to kind of businesses and the way that they do operations. It's been very effective. And how do we know it's been effective? It's been effective because the top players in our economy, Apple, Google, Facebook, Spotify, Amazon, right? You could add Microsoft to that list, all use Agile and have all used it to great success and have used it to dominate their positions in the market and kind of lead the American economy. So Agile is really at the root of all this change, and it's really fast becoming the new operational model for business if you want to be competitive in kind of this technology-driven, fast-paced world of modern American industry. What that's led to is a lot of companies wanting to adopt Agile, and I think over the last 5 years especially, we've seen a huge number of companies taking on Agile and wanting to making Agile a top priority for their companies and prioritizing it as their new operational model. And this has led to a lot of Agile adoption and a lot of very sloppy Agile adoption. So a lot of companies are struggling with it. And a lot of companies are being successful. So we tend to work with a lot of different clients who are adopting Agile, and we come into their organizations and help them do technical things and help them understand how to use Agile. So we kind of wanted to put this together to help our clients and other people who might be struggling with Agile adoption think about some of the important areas of Agile adoption. So first question that we have is, can you speak Agile, right? And this kind of gets to more than just speaking, it gets to speaking and being, right? If you speak a language, you understand how the people who speak that language think. So one thing to note here at the beginning is that when most people talk about Agile, what they're really usually talking about is Agile Scrum. So they're talking about user stories and sprints and doing stand-ups every day and having retrospectives. These are really Scrum-based processes, and it doesn't necessarily represent the fundamental pieces of what make Agile Agile. What makes Agile Agile are those 4 values and 12 principles that are captured in the Agile Manifesto. So you see here the 4 values. The ones on the left are the new values. The ones on the right are kind of the old operational model. And what the Agile Manifesto says is that the items on the left, or that the items on the right are important. They really are. They're still important. But the items on the left are more important and should be what companies focus on more than anything else. So it's important, I think, that companies, when you're looking at adopting Agile or you're thinking about it, that you start with the fundamentals. Start with these 4 values and the 12 principles and work your way up from there. Make sure that you understand the foundational philosophy of Agile, why you're doing these processes, right? Why are we doing retrospectives? Why do we do a stand-up every day, right? Why do we do product reviews? Why work in sprints, right? The Agile values and principles really get at that why, and you need to understand that before you get to the point of picking up a framework like Scrum. And then you have to ask yourself, well, does my organization really align with these principles, right? Can we get on board with this? Because a lot of these principles, I'll highlight a couple in the next slide, are pretty radical and represent a pretty radical shift in the way that companies have to think, have to measure value. So I think it's important to spend some time on the values and principles with your organization and your organizational leadership, and make sure that you understand what's being said here before you rush in and adopt Agile. And like most kind of simple things, simple but effective things in life, they may look simple and they may sound simple, but when you start doing them, you realize that it's actually a lot harder than it sounds. So I think spending time with the values and principles and thinking through how it applies to your business really helps you kind of figure out how you're going to do this in your company and some of the complications that this could create so you can get ahead of them. So this slide kind of outlines the 12 principles, right? I'll take one principle, for instance, that I think is a good one. When we talk about things that sound simple, but in the reality are more difficult. So number 7, working software is the primary measure of progress, right? It sounds simple. We all like working products, right? So I think it's easy to read that and say, great, that's easy. We love working software, right? But that's not what it's saying. What it's saying is is that working software is the primary measure of progress, right? Not ROI, not the efficiency of our workforce, not the bottom line and profit margin, all these kind of classic things that usually drive business projects. No, what it's saying is that the primary measure of progress is working software. That's what we're going to focus on creating. And I think what you find in Agile is that when you focus on that, those other things come. But you have to be adapted to looking at your value stream in a different way than kind of classic business principles teach you to. So sit with the Agile values and principles, learn to speak and think Agile first and foremost before you kind of move on to the later stages of adoption. So the second one is, right, if you learn to speak and think Agile and you sit with the Agile values and principles and you select a framework, you're going to start building teams. And I think this is an area where companies often get it wrong because the team model in Agile is very different than what companies are used to. So second question is, have you built your Agile teams correctly, right? The traditional team structure kind of operates like a relay race or a factory, right? We're very used to kind of this factory model of producing a thing, right? Employee A takes the widget and does what employee A does to the widget, then it passes on, the employee passes it on to employee B, who does their thing to the widget, who passes it on to employee C, who does their thing to the widget, right? Well, what if employee C finds something wrong with the widget that employee A was responsible for, right? Well, now employee C has to take the widget, stop their work, by the way, take the widget over to employee A, who's already working on a new widget, and say, hey, employee A, you messed this widget up and you have to fix what you did on it. Then employee A takes the widget, fixes what they've done, everything's stopped at this point, and they hand it to employee B, who's already working on their widget, and now their work's disrupted, right? And before it gets to employee C again, who can once again work on the widget. And employee C the whole time has been sitting there idle, not working on any widgets, waiting for their widget to get fixed, right? So this process may have worked in kind of an old economy, but it doesn't work in the new economy. So Agile proposes a pretty radically different way of building your teams that isn't based on kind of this relay race or factory type model of production. So how do Agile teams work? So if you look at the waterfall structure, that triangle there on the bottom left side, you see kind of how waterfall teams are organized typically. Waterfall, of course, being the standard project model that's been used for years with various degrees of success. You see that the teams are organized by function, just like that factory line we were talking about, right? You have blue team that does blue things, green team that does green things, and then white team that does white things, and each of them hand their product off to each other when they're done. Agile teams are organized differently. Agile teams are cross-functional. So they take all of the teams, representatives from each of the teams, and they mix them together to create complementary skill sets and abilities. Agile teams also don't have work pushed to them, right? In the waterfall module, the blue team gets work pushed to them, who then pushes work to the green team, who then pushes work to the white team in that factory model we were talking about. Agile teams are self-organizing. They pull work in. They say, here's what the business needs and here's what we're taking on. And then they self-organize. They decide themselves with their mixture of skills how to solve the problem in a new and creative way, right? This gives the team a lot of leeway to use their complementary skills and ability to practice what's called emergent design, right? To figure out the best way to build this product given what they know about what the company needs and what the company wants. And it allows them to leverage their internal creativity to do this. And then them being cross-functional also allows them to swarm work. So instead of doing work systematically and handing it off to each other, they're swarming the activities. They're getting together, especially the things that are bottlenecked. They're coming together to work on the problem, fix the problem, and get the production line moving again, rather than two team players sitting around while one team player fixes the thing that they're waiting on, right, in that factory line model that we talked about. One other thing I want to point out about cross-functional teams is what you see in the waterfall structure in that triangle below is that blue teams because they're doing blue things, get really, really, really good over time at doing blue things. And green teams get really, really, really good over time doing green things. But what happens if your company changes and you don't really need the people doing green things so much anymore? Well, what are you going to do with them? You have to lay them off and hire, blue dots or blue people, right, to do blue things? Well, that's pretty disruptive, right? Well, in an Agile organization, an Agile team, where you have cross-functional skills and all these people are working together, something interesting happens. Blue team people learn how to do green team things. They learn to think like green team people and understand what's important to green team people, right? So software developers work hand in hand with software testers, and they learn how software testers think so that they build better software. And testers learn how developers think, right? And so they know how to better test the software. So you get this cross-pollination and depth of experience that builds across Agile teams that I think is an important element of kind of how they function and why they're structured that way. So it's really, really important when you start standing up Agile teams that you build them correctly and you build them cross-functionally. But it's very different than the old model of doing it. So the third question is, do you have the right tools? Now, I know that one of the Agile values is that individuals and interactions are more important than processes and tools. But guess what? That doesn't mean processes and tools aren't important. It just means that individuals and interactions are more important. You still need the right set of processes and tools to do Agile and equip your team with those things in order to do Agile correctly. And I think a lot of companies can rush into doing Agile without first taking a step back and saying, okay, what tools and processes do we need to equip ourselves with to be successful in an Agile model? So there's a lot of things I could list here, but I list what I would kind of consider the top 5. One is a very good application lifecycle management tool. I think gone are the days of Microsoft Project and Gantt charts and extensive dependency mappings. More and more people, as they adopt Agile, are moving to kind of what I would call true application lifecycle management tools that allow you to manage user backlogs and user stories to effectively kind of create sprints and to push or to create a backlog of work for Agile teams to draw from and then help them coordinate that work. So I'm thinking of tools like Jira, Azure DevOps. We use Azure DevOps here at Sense Corp. We also use Jira for some of the other work that we do. There's CollabNet version 1. There's another tool. There's a whole host of them out there, a whole host of good tools. Figure out which one works for you and which one pairs best with your organization, your framework. The second one that I would point out are information radiators. What are information radiators? This is a very classic Agile term. So one of the main ideas in Agile is making work visible. So oftentimes a Scrum team will use a Kanban board, or even a Kanban team, especially a Kanban team, will use a Kanban board to put user stories on and track the work as it moves through kind of the phases of production, of sitting in the backlog to in production to maybe ready for test to done. And that Kanban board will be put up in a visible place for the whole team to look at and see where the work is. There's other things you can do like velocity charts, sprint burn down charts, anything you can do to visualize the work of the team and then radiate that information so the team always knows where they stand, where they're at, who's working on what. These are called information radiators. I think they're an important part of doing Agile the right way. The third one is Agile games. A big piece of Agile, and one of the things I love about Agile is that Agile kind of takes the attitude that work should be fun, because when work is fun, people are more creative. And guess what? In a knowledge-based service economy, people need to be creative. They're solving complex processes. There's a great book by a guy named Daniel Pink called Drive that goes into the scientific research behind this, that people really need to be having fun, to not be under too much pressure in order to exercise the right amount of creativity to solve kind of the complex modern problems that we're presented with in this new economy. And games help with that. Games help to take the routine work of, let's say, a retrospective, right? A lot of Agile teams, I think, get in there in retrospectives, and every single 2-week sprint, they end the retrospective with, okay, let's sit down and say, what worked, what didn't work, What can we do better? And every week it's what worked, what didn't work, what can we do better? Well, that's not inspiring, and teams get bored with that, right? There's hundreds of games that have been developed to help teams walk through retrospectives and to help them think about what worked and what didn't work and what they could do better in new and creative ways, right? Planning poker is another big Agile game when you're estimating task duration and trying to apply story points to different tasks and user stories. You can use planning poker, which is a pretty cool Agile game, to help teams think through in a fun way what it's going to take to accomplish a certain task or user story. So I really am a big fan of Agile games, and I think it's a hallmark of good Scrum Masters that they have a deep bag of games that they can pull out to kind of help the team have fun and be creative. The fourth one is automated testing. Automated testing, the importance of automated testing can really not be stressed enough in an Agile environment. And I think it's where a lot of teams can sink. When you're in an Agile environment, especially developing software, which is where this applies the most, you're being open to requirements change, right? We're creating something every 2 weeks and putting that thing in front of a user and saying, what do you like and what do you not like? And we're committed to changing what you don't like to make the product better for you. So this obviously leads to a lot of change and a lot of rework. Well, every time you change a product, you have to go back and test everything, right? Because you may have broke something that you don't know. So this creates a very high burden of regression testing in an Agile environment where you're doing 2-week sprints. So if you're releasing something every 2 weeks, you're making extensive changes to it, you constantly have to be doing regression testing. Well, if you have people doing manual regression testing and walking through, clicking this button, clicking that button, making sure this box works, you're going to drown in regression testing, and you're going to keep building what's called technical debt, trying to get through all that testing that's going to bury your team. So really, Agile has created the rise in what's called automated testing, where you use software like Selenium, Eggplant, Mabel, and there's a whole host of these tools that allow you to take things like clicking a button or clicking a URL, typing something into a search box, and automate those tests so that you can run 10,000 automated tests in a matter of 1 or 2 minutes every time that you make a change to the software. And what this allows you to do then is use your manual testing for things that can't be easily automated. So figuring out how you can utilize automated testing, what tools you want to use, and making sure you have the skills and expertise to do it are a pretty important part of doing Agile, and you need to figure out what tools you're going to have there. And the fifth is Agile ceremonies. So I think Agile ceremonies might be able to be lumped in process, but I like to think of them more as tools, because what Agile's done is kind of said, well, what's the baseline level of meetings that we need to have to make a team function, right? We don't want teams to spend any more time in meetings than they have to, because we want teams making things that work. That's what delivers value to the business, our working products. So every time we have our developers in a meeting, they're not out there creating what we need them to create to provide value to the business. So what are the bare minimum meetings we can have to keep everybody coordinated and on the same page and keep work aligned across the team to do work? But what that means then is that Agile ceremonies are very important. You can't skip out on them. I know meetings are unpopular and people don't like meetings, but these are very important meetings. And I think it's important to communicate to the teams that, hey, look, we have this set of meetings that we do every sprint. We're going to commit to time boxing those meetings and making sure that they are only going to be the amount that we say they're going to be, and we stop at the end. No matter where we're at, we stop at the end and we keep going. So that you communicate to them that, look, we're not going to waste your time with meetings, but when we do have meetings, it's important that you're there, it's important that you're on, and it's important that you're participating. So I think Agile ceremonies, the stand-up, the retrospective, the product review, the backlog grooming session, the sprint planning reviews, these are all really important, and you really can't skip out on them. So you need to think about how you're going to schedule them, when you're going to fit them in, who needs to be there. All that kind of needs to be planned out. And I consider it kind of a tool, these ceremonies, tools for doing Agile the right way. Do you have the right tools? The fourth question has to do with leadership and whether your leadership is really committed to the Agile model. Is your leadership committed? This is important because I think a lot of leaders can jump in and say we need to do Agile because our competitors are doing Agile, and who doesn't want to be more responsive to our customers and more responsive to the changing marketplace and changing products and requirements. That sounds great, so let's do Agile. But they don't spend that time, like we talked about in question 1, really sitting with the Agile values and principles and say, well, why are we doing Agile, and in what ways is Agile going to help us get where we need to be? So every year, a company called CollabNet version 1 puts out a massive survey to thousands and thousands of people globally called the State of Agile. And it culminates in a report called the State of Agile Report. So this data that I have on the slide comes from the 13th annual State of Agile report. And they have a variety of topics in there. I highly recommend you check it out. It's very, very useful and has a lot of great information. This particular piece I've pulled out has to do with challenges that people experience when adopting and scaling Agile. So let's look at the top 3 responses, because I think they're pretty instructive on this topic. 1, organizational culture is at odds with Agile values, 52%. General organizational resistance to change, that sounds pretty familiar, and inadequate management support and sponsorship. 44% answered that. And I really think that inadequate management support and sponsorship to a large degree drive the first 2, because if your management is really on board, if they understand what you're doing fully, why you're doing it, if they're bought into the process, then really that change gets driven from the top down, right? And that lowers the barriers to resistance. That means that they help drive a change in culture for adopting Agile. It's not just putting a new process in place. We're changing the organizational culture. And if we're going to change the culture of the organization, leadership has to be at the forefront of that change, or it's just not going to work. And if you look here on the left, the top 5 tips that people said were most helpful for successfully doing Agile were 1, hiring Agile coaches, which makes sense. If you're changing the operational model of your business, you're creating culture change, you need experts to come in and help you do that, right? So Agile coaches are very important. And then 2, the number 2 on the list is executive sponsorship. The executives have to be bought in. So people are realizing that if the executives and the leadership aren't bought in, you have a very low probability of having a very successful Agile transformation in your organization. And I think, as I mentioned, that it's important not just to do Agile, because you can do Agile, right? You can go out and say, we're going to adopt Scrum and read about Scrum and put all the Scrum processes in place, and maybe you're doing some Kanban and some XP as well, or maybe you're just going straight into like scaled Agile framework and scaling your teams, right? You can do that, but it's not going to be as successful as if you take the time to learn what it means to be Agile. This again goes back to question 1. How do we know what the underlying values and principles are that drive these processes that we're adopting? Because you're going to do and understand why you're doing the processes so much better when you know the foundation that they're built upon. So what this means really is leadership has to do that. Leadership can't just left brain think, we're going to put these processes in place and that's going to fix our problems. Leadership has to do some soul searching and some touchy-feely stuff to figure out how they want to change the culture of their organization and how that's going to undergird these processes. So I also think, given that this really represents a broad organizational change, a new operational model, a culture change, that you really have to spend a lot of time thinking about change management, and you need to look at change management best practices around adopting Agile. And you need to think before you start adopting it, how are we going to conduct this change management? What kind of training package do we want for our folks to make sure that they know what we're doing? Do we want to start small and scale and learn lessons on small teams before we scale? Are we going to have an executive leadership team that sponsors this and that keeps their finger on the pulse of adoption and communicates at a certain frequency the importance of this? And how do we align incentives for the workforce to say, this is what it's going to change for you and your work experience, and this is how what we're doing is going to improve your work experience, so you get buy-in from all the folks that are being asked to change the way they operate. Change management really can't be understated, the importance of it. And the last is remember that Agile methods and processes are adaptable. So once you kind of learn the principles and values and understand what they are, once you implement the processes, you can adapt those processes. You can change those processes. The major idea behind Agile is, and the reason you're doing these retrospectives, is to figure out what works and doesn't work for your organization. When we looked at those big companies like Microsoft and Google and Spotify that all use Agile, they all do use Agile, but over the last decade of using it, they have each evolved their own way of doing Agile. But here's one thing I want to caution, is because I think a lot of companies go in and they pick and choose from the Agile frameworks to do Agile, and then they end up doing kind of Agile halfway, and it's not very successful, and they get frustrated and say this doesn't work. I'm a big proponent of, I think you know the rules, you follow the rules, and then you break the rules. So start with a framework and do what the framework says. If it's Scrum, start with Scrum, read the Scrum guide, do Scrum the way that Scrum says you do Scrum, and do it that way for a while and work through the frustrations in the process. And then when you really understand Scrum and why you're doing what you're doing, and everybody's gotten in the rhythm of doing it, then you can start to retrospect on maybe some of these processes we can drop, or maybe we can adapt them to best fit us. And I think that's when Agile starts to really produce some value in your organization. When you get good enough at it, then you can begin to tailor the processes to your organization. But if you're tailoring the processes, you really need to know those values and principles and make sure that you're staying true to those while you're tailoring the processes. So as your leadership committed to it, and you really thought about how you're going to implement it. And the last one that I want to go over here is, do you know how to contract Agile services? Almost every company these days realizes that they're not good at everything and brings in outside help to help them develop software, implement change, whatever. How do you contract Agile services, right? There's the popular model in industry right now is fixed price and fixed duration. It makes sense, right? Because if I know the price up front and I know how long it's going to take, then there's no risk for me, right, when I'm buying something. I think that's the attitude. In reality, what kind of this fixed price, fixed duration, waterfall-based model has shown us is that in actuality, you're taking a lot of risk, because the risk is you're going to get what you paid for in the beginning. And what you paid for wasn't necessarily, in the beginning, what you really wanted, right? You're planning everything at the beginning. And the problem with planning everything at the beginning is that the beginning of the project is your dumbest point in the project. That's before we learn all the rich lessons that come from actually doing the work of the project. If you're an experienced project manager like myself, or you've worked on a number of projects, I bet you've seen that as you start the project with a vast requirement set, you start building the things that you had planned to build, everything begins to change as you learn more about what you're building. And you say, well, why didn't we put this requirement in there? And who wrote this requirement? Because this one doesn't make any sense. Or, oh, we really should have built this thing this way. We realize that now that we built it in the wrong way, that there's a better way to do it, right? So this is why you see, if you look at this model on the right, of the cost of a project in Waterfall and Agile over time, that Waterfall really begins to drift further and further and further away from delivering value, because you've planned everything at the beginning and you've taken out the ability to create feedback loops that keep you on the right track, right? You've taken out the ability to be responsive to that change that comes from learning in the project, so it gets further and further and further out of sync with what the company actually needs. And it does this by encumbering that feedback cycle, right? If you have to go through a massive change management process to change a single requirement, and it's going to end up costing extra money, but you're already over budget, then you're creating incentives that don't align with requirements change, right? You're de-incentivizing responding to intelligent change. So what is the way you do it? How should we contract in an Agile environment? So I think the best way to do it is duration and cost. But I understand that when you're hiring a new vendor, that's a pretty scary thing to do, to just write a blank check and say, hey, we'll pay you for your time, and it takes what it takes. So I think duration and cost with performance holdbacks can be the best way to start, right? It does limit your risk somewhat as someone who's hiring a vendor, and it allows you to kind of hold back some money based on performance, so it creates some incentives for the vendor to perform. But I think it can still risk kind of this us versus them mentality, because if I'm holding back, let's say I hold back 30% of the value of your work based on you delivering, the vendor delivering what they said they were going to deliver, let's say, 50 story points, right? Well, there's a number of reasons that the vendor may not have been able to finish that work. Maybe some of those reasons are the company's fault. Maybe some of those reasons are the vendor's fault. And it kind of gets you into that us versus them mentality. And really in Agile, what we want is to be collaborating together to be transparent about what's going wrong and what's going right, and then retrospecting on that and fixing it together, right? Company and vendor. So I think the team as a service model with the performance holdbacks can be a good way to start off with contractors and a new relationship, and maybe iterate through that in 3-4 sprints while you're getting to know each other and to build that trust. But I think ultimately where you want to be is with a vendor that you really trust and you've built relationship with and that you feel comfortable collaborating with. And going to a duration and cost model. And remember, in Agile, you're reducing the risk by working in sprints. So every 2 to 4 weeks, you're going to have something to look at. The teams are going to be putting something that they've built that actually can start working and delivering value in front of the business and saying, what do you think about this? So at any given stage, you have full transparency into what's going on, what's being built, and how much it's meeting your requirements. And you have a full ability to introduce changing requirements, right? And say, oh, that's kind of what we wanted, but I don't think it's quite what we wanted, or there's been a shift in the market, so we need to change some of these things a little bit and go back and rework it. And that's really where you get that value. And that's really where you limit the risk in a duration and cost style contract. But unfortunately, what we see are a lot of companies who want to be Agile, but they're still contracting in fixed price, fixed duration. And when the price is fixed and the schedule is fixed, then the scope is kind of fixed by nature. It's really hard to change the scope. So if you want to embrace change and embrace changing requirements to do Agile, I really recommend some version of a duration and cost type of contract. So know how to contract Agile services. So those are kind of the 5 questions that we've gone through, kind of take you through some of the things that I hope that if you're thinking about adopting Agile, you take the time to think about before you rush in and adopt Agile. And these are things we like to help coach our clients through and think about. We created an ebook on this topic that you can find at this link on the presentation. And I hope you read it. And if you guys have any questions that you think of as you're going through your process, we're always here and glad to help engage and use what we know to help anybody be successful. That's why we're in the business we're in. So thanks for coming along, and I think now, Kelly, we'll move into Q&A session.
Definitely, yes, and you will be getting a link to this ebook following the webinar with the recording, so make sure you look for that. Thank you, Ben, great presentation. Now let me see, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. We have a few in here right now I'm going to go through, and if you're on the line, just go ahead and type in anything as you come up with it. So the first one here, Ben, is how long does it take to be a fully functioning Agile team or organization?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the unfortunate answer is it depends. But one of the things that it depends on is how you're implementing Agile, right? Are you just implementing a couple of Scrum teams? I think that can happen relatively quickly to set up a Scrum team, a couple of Scrum teams, get them operating, right? It also depends on the prep work you've done before you implement Agile and get it going, right? Have you done some of the things we talked about in here to get your teams stood up, right? Do you know what your framework is? Have you educated your people in advance? Did you build your teams the correct way? To the greater extent that you did your homework beforehand, before setting it up and did that change management, got leadership on board, all the things we talked about, I think the quicker you're going to move through those kinds of cycles and get better at it because you set yourself up for success. I think if you're going all out and you're implementing a scaled Agile framework and you're standing up, 70 Scrum teams with 10 Agile release trains, and you are 10 Agile release trains, and you're kind of massively scaling your organization, that could take 1-2 years to get right. But I think my favorite way to answer this would be kind of in Agile, there's this idea that you never arrive, right? You never get there. You're always iterating through and getting better and better and better. So the way I like to think about Agile is there's not like some point where we reach Agile nirvana, right, after a month or two. Is that we're always looking at ourselves and our processes and saying, how can we change? How can we get better? How can we adapt to the changing realities around us? That's what makes Agile powerful, is that feedback cycle and that focus on continuous improvement that makes us better and better and better and allows us to be responsive to change in a way that these old operational models don't.
Great, thank you. Okay, the last question here is, I heard you mention several different frameworks during the presentation. Is there one that you suggest?
So there are a whole lot of frameworks out there for Agile, but if you look at the State of Agile report that came out, the one by CollabNet version 1 that I talked about, 76% of those surveyed said that they were using some form of Scrum, right? Whether that be a Scrum Kanban hybrid, Scrum XP hybrid. I think the reason for that, and the reason that Scrum kind of is the one that I would recommend for most people, is that Scrum really has a lot of defined processes and a lot of defined roles and a lot of certifications you can get to help the people in the teams understand what their role is and how they should operate. And I think that's a great place for businesses to start. Like I said, that whole know the rules, follow the rules, break the rules. Well, Scrum gives you some rule sets to start with to get you started doing Agile. So I highly recommend Scrum. I think it's been adopted pretty widely because it offers such a good support structure and because it has such a kind of well-defined processes and roles to get people started, that it gives people this kind of great starting place for getting their feet wet with Agile until they get good enough to start adopting those Scrum processes or adapting those Scrum processes for their own needs.
All right, thank you. We are going to go ahead and close the webinar now. Keep in mind that you will be receiving the follow-up email later today. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email us directly at marketing@sensecorp.com. We look forward to speaking with you, and have a great rest of your day.